Tonight we will be talking about building on the rock, and this is the path to stability and blessing. I would like to remind you that we must not condemn other people. This is what we found recently. We should ask for our righteousness and do it constantly. This is another important thing which we just found. And just last week we found that we should choose the narrow gates. Today we are going to finish contemplating on Matthew chapter 7. Let me remind you that we are talking about Yeshua's commandments in the context of his covenant. That's why this is very important to keep them, because we want to be his servants and we want to be in covenant with him. So, let's open Yeshua's teaching and read our portion for tonight. We will be reading about two foundations. This is Matthew chapter 7. I will be reading verse 24 and 25. Therefore, Yeshua says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and yet it didn't fall, for its foundation had been built on the rock." And we have two more verses. "Everyone who hears these words," says Yeshua in verse 26, "everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall." What was Yeshua's occupation? Theoretically, he and his father could have been craftsmen who produced wooden goods. It's a possibility. Another possibility is this. And by the way, many scholars believe that it is likely that Joseph and his sons were construction workers. We cannot tell for sure if it was the case, but it is interesting how Yeshua demonstrates here a professional builder's approach. Let us say a few words about the background of the teaching. The common motive of the parable of the two foundations is found in wisdom literature. For example, we open Proverbs chapter 14 verse 11 and we see there, "The house of the wicked will be demolished, but the tent of the upright will flourish." In this proverb, Solomon demonstrates how the blessings and the curses of the covenant work. Interestingly, the wicked persons possess a house, whereas the upright live in the tent. This theoretically can point to Abraham's tent, Abraham's righteousness, and description of Abraham's death. In Genesis chapter 25 verse 8 we read, "Abraham died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life." Thus, the passage we study today is about our eternal future and our satisfaction, our eternal satisfaction. We see how Abraham was blessed. We see how people who are upright, they live in tents and they are blessed. And also we see that the person who builds on the rock, he or she will be blessed. Thus, the passage we study today is about eternal future, as I said, and the metaphor of the two houses is not only an indicator of that. There are other indicators. The kingdom of God. Let's read this verse, Matthew chapter 7 verse 24. "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock." Look at the beginning of the first sentence. It starts with "therefore everyone." Therefore sends us to the previous words, because we typically do not begin phrases like this. Therefore is something which is continued, therefore sends us to the previous text. Everyone helps us to identify the particular verse. Everyone is found in verse 21. This is verse 21 where Yeshua says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." So this verse is connected to the parable of the two foundations. Thus, the parable of the two foundations is about the kingdom of heaven and about the opportunity to enter there. The parable of the two foundations is not a comparison between the two types of foundation. This is an invitation to enter the kingdom of God, the invitation to build on the rock, the invitation to enter the kingdom. And in verse 25, Yeshua continues, "And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and yet it didn't fall, for its foundation had been built on the rock." Both houses are identical. The only difference is in elements. The only different elements are their foundations. The seashore of the Sea of Galilee had a hard layer of alluvial sand during the hot summer month. However, wise builders would not be deceived by this superficial condition. Instead, they would dig deep, sometimes up to 10 feet below the sandy surface, until reaching the solid bedrock. It was on this stable foundation that the builders would establish the base for the house. Archaeological excavations revealed the presence of basalt stone bedrock, which was evidently utilized as the foundation for ancient structures. Thus, the words of Yeshua were understandable and practical. And this house was tested by rain, the house was tested by floods, the house was tested by the winds, and another house likewise was tested by the rain, by the winds, by the flooding. And then everything was tested, and this test reveals the difference. The difference becomes obvious after this test. One house still stands. Another house is broken. And here in this parable, we see the idea of wise and foolish. As you can see, there was a wise man who built his house on the rock. The wise man in Greek is phronimos, sensible, thoughtful, prudent, wise, and this word, interestingly, is found 7 times in Matthew. 7 times. 2 foundations, it's about wise men. We also have be wise as serpents and innocent as doves in Matthew 10. Be wise. Faithful and wise slave is described in Matthew 24. And then we have 10 virgins. Half of this number is wise virgins. They are found in Matthew 25. It is not by chance that we find this word, which is used 7 times. Every case where we find this word is to a certain extent eschatological or related to the last events, which assumes the final destiny of a person. Every occurrence is related to actions. We should act. We should enter the kingdom of God. And we also have this foolish man. Foolish man in Greek is moros. Foolish or stupid. English moron derives from this Greek root. This word is used, interestingly, 6 times by Matthew, and again this is not by chance. 7 is the number of God. 6 is the number of Satan. Why do we have these opposites? Why do we have these two contrasting elements? These alternatives are very similar to the alternatives found in the book of Deuteronomy. See, says Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, and death and evil. What I am commanding you today is to love Adonai your God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His mitzvot, or commandments, statutes, and ordinances. Then you will live and multiply, and Adonai your God will bless you in the land you are going to possess. Let us think about practical value of this teaching. Let us think about this, and here is our practice. What do we have here? We found that the Sermon on the Mount is Yeshua's covenantal speech. We found that righteousness and the commandments of the teacher create the foundation of the new covenant. The Messiah covenant is sealed with blessings and curses. The covenantal speech, or so-called the Sermon on the Mount, is sealed with blessings and curses as well. Yeshua delivered the most famous and the most powerful sermon in human history. At the end of this sermon, he challenged his listeners to act. There were numerous debates among the rabbis of the first century. What is more important, listening or doing? Many of them came to the conclusion that listening was more important because without listening, doing was impossible. However, Yeshua highlighted the fact that although listening was important, it would not bring any blessing. Exactly like Moses finalized his covenant or sealed his covenant with blessings and curses, Yeshua also gave the idea of the two foundations, which represent blessings and curses of the new covenant. What do we choose? Do we choose the right foundation, the rock, doing His commandments? In this case, we will enter the kingdom of God. Do we choose just listening? In this case, our house will collapse, because listening without doing is the house built on the sand. He, Yeshua, challenges us today. He, Yeshua, says that idling brings curses. He, Yeshua, says to us, doing brings blessings. Doing is the firm foundation. Doing is the way of righteousness. Doing is the path to stability and blessing.